The phone rang softly in the quiet of Eleanor Stanton's study, the late afternoon sunlight cutting across the mahogany desk and glinting off the brass ornaments she had collected over the years. She picked up the receiver, her fingers steady but her mind alert, knowing that any conversation with her son, Henry, could be more revealing than polite small talk. "Hello," she said, her voice calm but carrying the underlying warmth of a mother used to reading between the lines. On the other end, Henry's voice trembled, almost imperceptibly, as if he were weighing every word. "Mom, I think maybe it's better if you don't come to the wedding," he said, the hesitation dragging the sentence out painfully. Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest, but she did not respond immediately. She heard the subtle quiver, the soft edge of fear in his tone, the carefulness with which he chose his words. "The guests, they're very particular. They expect a certain atmosphere," he added, the word lingering like a warning. Eleanor's mind filled with images of crystal chandeliers, polished silver cutlery, and tables draped with silk linens, all sparkling perfection masking subtle judgments and hidden cruelty. She listened to her son's uneasy attempts to soften the blow, telling her the attendees don't mean any harm, but that they simply wanted everything to be flawless. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened, not from anger, but from a deep, quiet calculation. She had lived her life building quietly, without the benefit of inherited wealth or a prestigious family name. She understood immediately that this was not about malice, it was about exclusion, the thinly veiled boundaries of old social hierarchies that even her son felt pressured to respect. Henry paused on the line, his breath audible, as if he were trying to measure how much of the truth he could reveal. They probably wouldn't even notice if you weren't there. They care more about appearances than people," he said softly, almost as if confessing a private guilt. Eleanor allowed herself a moment to absorb his words, thinking of her own life, a self-made woman who had raised her son alone, carving out her fortune and reputation with tireless discipline and careful planning. She remembered the late nights spent negotiating contracts, the silent victories in boardrooms where her ideas carried more weight than the polished facades of others, and the sacrifices she had made to ensure Henry never felt the sting of social rejection. And yet, despite everything, this moment felt familiar, a reminder of the invisible walls that wealth and class could still construct around a person. She leaned back in her chair, gazing at the framed photographs of Rosewood Manor, her sprawling estate that was hers by legal right but had never truly felt like a shield against the judgment of others. Her silence was deliberate. She knew that any reaction, any show of anger or hurt, would be interpreted as weakness by the very people Henry was trying to protect her from. She imagined the event, the fine linens, the perfectly folded napkins, the polite but scrutinizing smiles, and the subtle ways in which her presence might be questioned, minimized, or ignored. Yet within her stirred a quiet determination. If they thought they could exclude her, they had underestimated her capacity to act strategically, to use the tools at her disposal without needing approval or validation from anyone. "Mom, I know this is hard," Henry said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't want to tell you like this, but they expect a certain kind of perfection. It's not about you personally. They just want things perfect." Eleanor held the phone close, her eyes narrowing slightly as she pictured the people Henry spoke of, the investors, the influential politicians, the families who measured worth by the weight of a name or the shimmer of a jewel. Her mind wandered to the fiancé's parents, imagining the mother with her thin, calculating smile, the father with his firm handshake and the easy laughter that demanded respect. They had likely never thought of Eleanor as a person to be considered, only as an afterthought, an invisible presence who might disrupt the illusion of control they so carefully maintained. Eleanor allowed herself a quiet, inward smile, not of triumph, but of clarity. She had navigated spaces like this before, where power was assumed rather than earned, where exclusion was a quiet weapon wielded by those who misunderstood strength. She pictured herself walking into the room, understated, elegant, but unmistakably present, a silent assertion of authority that required no applause. Her son's words, spoken in caution, in love, in fear, reminded her that even well-intentioned compliance could carry consequences, that his attempt to protect her could feel like betrayal. Yet she had learned long ago that patience and subtlety often wielded greater power than confrontation or rage. She let the conversation continue, listening carefully, her mind already turning over possibilities, strategies, and the ways she might quietly assert herself without needing permission from anyone. As the conversation continued, Eleanor allowed herself to reflect on her past encounters with subtle class prejudice. She remembered parties she had attended in her early career, where polite questions about her late husband's occupation and casual comments about her accent had stung far more than open rudeness ever could. The insult had never been poverty itself, but the deliberate attempt to erase her existence, to frame her as someone who did not belong, someone whose achievements were invisible unless legitimized by old money or connections. She thought of the long years spent proving herself, quietly and methodically, in boardrooms and legal offices, never relying on anyone's approval. Eleanor's voice remained calm as Henry spoke, guiding the conversation gently, yet every word he said was a reminder of the social boundaries that had been drawn around her. She recalled the purchase of Rosewood Manor 20 years ago, executed through a holding firm overseas, completed swiftly and without negotiation, leaving the seller astonished at her decisiveness. That moment had marked a turning point, a demonstration that true power was often subtle, unseen, and unannounced. Eleanor allowed herself a private smile, thinking about the way she could now leverage that same quiet authority, not to humiliate, but to assert her presence in a space that had sought to exclude her. Every contract, every clause managed by the estate company she controlled, provided a potential doorway, a subtle avenue to make herself seen without needing confrontation or dramatics. Her thoughts shifted to strategy, to timing, to the way she could enter that elite gathering not as an intruder, but as someone whose authority was undeniable, if only quietly recognized. Henry sighed on the line, a mixture of relief and guilt audible in his voice. I just don't want you to be hurt, Mom. They're different. They care about appearances, status, what looks right on paper. Eleanor nodded, though he could not see her, understanding precisely what he meant. She pictured the wedding invitations, the subtle cues of class, the small details that communicated hierarchy more than words ever could. She imagined the ceremony, the polished speeches, the curated smiles, and the unspoken judgment that would hover in the air. And yet, beneath all that, Eleanor felt a surge of quiet determination. She had built Rosewood Manor, her empire, her reputation, with meticulous care, and she knew that the very people who tried to define worth through appearances would be caught off guard by the reality she represented. "Henry," she said finally, her voice steady, "thank you for telling me. I understand the situation, but do not mistake my absence for weakness. Sometimes, the quietest presence can carry the greatest weight." She imagined walking into that room, early, unnoticed, but in full possession of authority, ready to claim her moment without needing to seek anyone's approval. Henry's pause on the line was filled with unspoken understanding, the shared recognition that strength could be understated, patient, and deliberate. Eleanor ended the call, placing the receiver gently back on its cradle, and sat for a long moment in contemplation. She could feel the plan forming in her mind, a quiet assertion, a presence that could not be ignored, a lesson in power that required no confrontation, only timing, strategy, and unshakable self-possession. In the days that followed, Eleanor moved through her home with purposeful calm, as if every step was measured and intentional. She contacted the Rosewood Manor estate manager, Jonathan Blake, a loyal and discreet professional who had worked under her direction for over a decade, handling every detail from renovations to guest accommodations. "Jonathan," she began, her tone precise, "I want a full review of the upcoming wedding arrangements. Please provide me with a guest list, the itinerary, and any special requests from the organizers. I need to understand every facet of this event." Jonathan hesitated slightly, sensing the undercurrent of authority in her voice that went beyond a casual request. "Of course, Mrs. Stanton. I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning." Eleanor smiled faintly, knowing that her knowledge of the event would be her leverage. She had no desire for confrontation, no urge to make a scene. She only wanted the truth laid bare and her rightful influence acknowledged, even if indirectly. In private, she reviewed the documents, noting the absence of her name on any invitations or contracts, confirming what she already knew. The organizers had assumed they could define who mattered in her home, without consulting the one person who legally owned it. Eleanor's thoughts lingered on her son, imagining the mixture of loyalty and guilt he would carry, and she resolved that her actions would be measured, precise, and unforgettable, not for revenge, but as a demonstration of the power inherent in quiet authority. That evening, Eleanor and Henry shared dinner, though the conversation remained delicately weighted with unspoken tension. Henry fidgeted with his silverware, glancing occasionally at his mother, aware of her quiet assessment. "I feel bad, Mom," he said finally, pushing peas across his plate. "I didn't want to hurt your feelings by saying it. I thought maybe you'd be more comfortable not going." Eleanor studied him for a moment, the familiar concern and protective instinct shining in his eyes. "Henry," she said gently, "you did exactly what you should have. Honesty isn't betrayal. But understand this. Discomfort does not equate to defeat, and absence does not equate to safety. There is a difference between retreat and strategy." Henry looked down, absorbing her words, the weight of her wisdom settling around him like a soft cloak. He nodded slowly, the beginnings of understanding flickering in his expression, though fear still lingered. Eleanor allowed the moment to pass without pressing further, knowing that clarity often arrived more steadily than forcefully. She thought of the wedding's grand hall, of the carefully arranged flowers and elegant guests, and the way her presence could be asserted without fanfare. The lesson she wanted to teach was subtle yet undeniable, that true authority did not need approval, and power often manifested most effectively when least expected. Over the following week, Eleanor took care to arrive at Rosewood Manor each day in a manner that felt routine, visiting the estate's offices, checking the grounds, and speaking briefly with Jonathan about minor adjustments to lighting and seating arrangements. She was meticulous, yet outwardly serene, moving like a shadow through a world that assumed she would remain in the background. When Jonathan expressed concern that the wedding organizers might be surprised by her level of oversight, Eleanor only smiled. "They are surprised by what they fail to notice," she said softly. "True influence is never announced." She reviewed the schedule for the ceremony, identifying a small, overlooked clause in the contracts that required the host to give a brief address to welcome guests before the proceedings began. She realized that this brief, seemingly inconsequential moment could be her opportunity, a perfectly legal and strategic opening to assert her presence, without confrontation. Eleanor's mind worked in quiet fascination at the simplicity of it. The organizers' assumptions about superiority had blinded them to reality. Meanwhile, Henry continued to fidget between excitement and anxiety over the wedding, unsure how to reconcile his mother's quiet power with the expectations of a social world that often valued appearances above integrity. Eleanor understood his conflicted feelings, but knew that their roles were clear. She would demonstrate authority, he would witness it, and the world would learn, if only subtly, that ownership and respect were not dictated by social pretense. Finally, the wedding day arrived, and Eleanor approached Rosewood Manor in the early morning light, dressed in a simple, elegant outfit that radiated understated authority. She parked her car quietly at the edge of the estate, walking up the driveway as Jonathan met her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Mrs. Stanton," he said, his voice low, "you are early." Eleanor gave him a faint, serene smile. "I want to observe before the crowd arrives," she replied, moving past him into the great hall, where workers were arranging flowers and staff were bustling quietly with last-minute preparations. She noticed the subtle details, the way a silver candelabra leaned slightly, the placement of a chair, and gave concise, precise instructions. No one outside the estate staff noticed her presence, yet the room itself seemed to respond to her quiet command. As she walked through the corridors, Eleanor felt a familiar sense of clarity. She had built her authority over decades, in ways unnoticed by those who assumed power came only from status or wealth inherited. Today, she would demonstrate that influence derived from knowledge, foresight, and patience could outweigh the shallow judgments of a social elite. She rehearsed her brief address mentally, careful to maintain calm, precision, and dignity, knowing that a single misstep could shift the narrative. Her son Henry arrived shortly afterward, nervously adjusting his tie, casting hesitant glances toward her. Eleanor nodded at him once, silently conveying both reassurance and the gravity of what was to come. Guests began to arrive, all polished, all performing the expected gestures of privilege. Eleanor observed from a quiet corner, noting the subtle ways in which hierarchy was displayed, the quick glance at cufflinks, the careful avoidance of casual conversation with those deemed beneath notice, the tiny, orchestrated smiles that sought to assert dominance without words. The bride's parents were particularly exacting, moving through the room with a tight control over every interaction, their expressions carefully curated to communicate refinement and influence. Eleanor's presence, initially unnoticed, began to register in fleeting, subconscious ways, a pause here, a flicker of curiosity there. She allowed the moment to stretch, seeing how easily people assumed authority was defined by social conformity, failing to recognize that true power existed quietly, legally, and undeniably. Henry stayed close, uncertain whether to approach or maintain distance, but Eleanor merely smiled faintly and gestured subtly toward the seating arrangements. As the time for the pre-ceremony address approached, Eleanor walked to the small podium near the front of the hall, and Jonathan handed her the microphone, his expression a mixture of pride and slight awe. The organizers had not questioned her. They had assumed they controlled the narrative, unaware that their oversight had created the opening she had been waiting for. Eleanor inhaled calmly, looking out at the sea of poised, polished faces, and began to speak with quiet authority. "Good morning," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the hall in a way that demanded attention without raising volume. The room fell into an unexpected hush, the soft rustle of silk and shifting chairs marking the sudden awareness of her presence. "I would like to welcome you all to Rosewood Manor," she continued, letting each word settle deliberately. "This estate has been under my care for over 20 years. Every corner, every stone, every carefully cultivated garden is part of the property I purchased and maintain. I am Eleanor Stanton, and while some documents and invitations may suggest otherwise, it is my privilege and responsibility to oversee this estate." The room shifted subtly. The bride's mother's smile faltered for a brief second, and the father's eyes narrowed slightly, struggling to reconcile their assumptions with reality. Eleanor did not raise her voice, did not accuse or confront. She merely stated the facts, letting the truth carry its own weight. "It appears there was some expectation that my presence would not be required or appropriate," she said, pausing to allow the words to sink in. "But I am here to remind you that ownership, respect, and belonging are not determined by social standing or appearances. This estate is under my care, and your judgments do not alter that fact." A heavy silence settled over the hall, a quiet tension that replaced the performative politeness of the guests with the simple recognition of reality. Eleanor glanced briefly at Henry, whose expression reflected a dawning understanding of the quiet, unannounced authority his mother had always possessed. The bride's parents exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from polite control to discomfort. Eleanor could see their brief internal calculations, the attempts to measure, to regain authority, to reassert dominance over a situation that had quietly escaped their management. She allowed them the moment to process, speaking neither too quickly nor too slowly, merely letting the facts speak for themselves. "The invitation may have been extended in the hope of convenience," she said softly, "but it cannot and will not dictate who belongs here. My son, Henry, and all who enter this estate are welcomed or evaluated under the stewardship of the property's owner, not by assumptions of social hierarchy. The land, the house, the events held here fall under my care, and no one's judgment can redefine that." Eleanor's eyes swept across the room, meeting gaze after gaze with calm assurance. The polite murmurs began to rise, but no one interrupted. Her authority had been established by the combination of law, preparation, and composure. Henry, standing just behind her, seemed to inhale more fully, the weight of social expectations lifting slightly as he realized the quiet strength of his mother's presence. Eleanor concluded her address with a simple, deliberate statement. Power does not seek validation, and authority does not require applause. Silence, patience, and preparation often speak louder than any act of aggression. I am present, I am in charge, and nothing here changes that. She returned the microphone to Jonathan, her composure intact, and stepped aside. The guests were frozen in a combination of surprise, respect, and subtle embarrassment. The bride's mother's tight smile faltered completely, and the father's attempts at controlled composure were evident in the tension of his shoulders. Eleanor did not linger. She did not expect recognition or praise. She walked past Henry, who met her eyes with awe and regret mingled together. The son's earlier attempts to shield her from discomfort were understood in a new light. He had acted out of love, but she had acted out of authority and clarity. Henry approached his mother quietly, the emotions he had carried all week converging in a single moment. "Mom, I see it now," he whispered, his voice thick. "I thought I was protecting you, but you've done it better than I imagined." Eleanor smiled faintly, placing a hand on his shoulder, steadying him with her calm presence. "Henry, protection is sometimes best served by understanding, not shielding," she said softly. "We do not need others to acknowledge us for our strength to exist. Remember that." The son nodded, absorbing the lesson in silence, understanding finally the depth of her quiet authority. Eleanor had not humiliated anyone, had not demanded recognition. She had merely exercised the undeniable control she possessed. The social elite, who had assumed their judgments were decisive, were now confronted with a subtle but undeniable reality. Ownership, preparation, and quiet strength outweighed their assumptions and performances. As the ceremony began, Eleanor retreated to the background, observing quietly but assuredly. The wedding proceeded with all its trappings, flowers, music, carefully choreographed movements, yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere had shifted. Guests were aware now, perhaps subconsciously, that appearances were not the ultimate measure of authority. Eleanor's presence had left an imprint that would persist far longer than any momentary discomfort. She did not linger for applause. She did not watch for approval. Her lesson was complete simply by being. Her son, now standing beside her, carried with him a new understanding of integrity and quiet power. They did not need confrontation to assert themselves. Clarity and timing had accomplished what aggression never could. Eleanor left the hall before the vows, walking past the now conscious guests who could not ignore her authority. She passed Jonathan quietly, nodding once in acknowledgement of his loyalty and careful execution. Outside, the air was crisp, the early afternoon sunlight reflecting off the manor's stonework, and Eleanor felt the clarity of a woman who had acted decisively, without distraction or need for validation. She had used the simplest tools, law, preparation, and timing, to assert her presence in a room where social performance often overshadowed substance. The lessons she had imparted would linger quietly in the minds of those who had assumed superiority, and her son would carry the understanding of strength through silence forward in his life. Driving away from Rosewood Manor, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. There was no triumph in the conventional sense, no applause, no visible acknowledgement, but there was clarity, a quiet confirmation of her agency. The wedding continued without incident, yet its social hierarchy had been subtly but indelibly shifted. Eleanor understood that she had acted not for vengeance, but for affirmation of reality. The law, the estate, and her decades of effort were immutable. She reflected on the way appearances could deceive and how patience and observation often carry greater weight than any confrontation. Henry sat beside her, silent at first, processing the events that had unfolded. Finally, he spoke, voice subdued. "I think I understand now, Mom. They can't decide who belongs here. You've shown me that." Eleanor glanced at him, her expression warm yet firm. "Correct. Belonging is not a matter of approval from others. It is the recognition of reality and the authority that comes from preparation, integrity, and ownership. Today, you witnessed that firsthand. Henry nodded, a weight lifted from his shoulders, the tension of the past week dissipating as he absorbed her wisdom. As the car drove down the long tree-lined avenue, Eleanor allowed herself a quiet reflection. The guests had been left with the truth of her authority, unannounced and undeniable. The bride's parents, the polished social elite, would carry a subtle awareness that not all power could be measured by appearance or inherited status. And Henry, now seeing his mother not as someone to protect, but as an exemplar of quiet strength, began to internalize the value of patience, timing, and the unshakable confidence of knowing one's worth. Eleanor smiled faintly, not for herself, but for the lesson imparted, a subtle but enduring assertion that would ripple through the lives of those who had assumed dominance over a world they only partially understood. By the time they reached the edge of the estate, Eleanor felt the serene satisfaction of a woman who had acted decisively and without need for recognition. She had taught a lesson in authority and ownership, in patience and quiet strength, and in the difference between presence and performance. Rosewood Manor remained hers unshaken, as did her confidence. She did not look back, and she did not need to. The silence she had chosen had spoken louder than any words, the lesson left indelibly in the minds of those who had underestimated her. As she drove into the open road beyond the estate, Eleanor Stanton carried with her the unshakable knowledge that power, when exercised thoughtfully, quietly, and with precision, always commanded respect, even from those who thought themselves untouchable.